listen to this alone in the dark.
I only opened my apartment door because I thought it was my neighbor coming back drunk again and dropping his keys in the hallway. And at first, that was all it sounded like. Metal scraping across the floor outside my door, and then a slow, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled over old carpet. And I remember being annoyed before I was scared, because it was after 2 in the morning, and I had work the next day, and the walls in that building were thin enough that you could hear somebody clear their throat 3 units down. So when the sound stopped right outside my door, I got up off my couch and stood there listening with my hand on the lock, waiting for the usual muttered apology or the shuffle of someone getting themselves together. But there was nothing, not even footsteps. And I said, "You good out there?" And my own voice sounded stupid the second it left my mouth, because the hallway answered with total silence. The kind that feels wrong because apartment hallways are never fully quiet. There is always a vent moving air, a TV behind a wall, an elevator door opening somewhere. But right then, it felt like the whole floor had stopped with whoever or whatever was standing outside. I looked through the peephole, and at first I thought the lens was smudged, because all I could make out was a dark shape too close to the door. Something taller than the frame, something pressed in so near that it blocked the hallway light. And when it shifted, I saw part of it move sideways across the glass, and realized it was not a coat or a person leaning there. It was skin, if I can even call it that, pale and tight and cracked in long, dry lines, like something had been bent too many times and never healed right. And I jerked back so fast I hit the wall behind me and just stood there, staring at the door, because my brain was still trying to turn it into a person. Some sick neighbor, somebody wearing something, anything that fit into the world I already knew. And then it made a sound, right on the other side of the wood. Not loud, not sudden, just close enough that I felt it through the door before I understood what I was hearing. And every hair on my arms lifted at once, because there was no human breath inside that sound. No voice in it, no effort to imitate one. Just this wet, aware noise, like it knew I was there, and had decided that was enough. I should have called the police right then, and maybe if I had done that first, I would have stayed inside and pretended the rest of that night never happened. But I made the mistake people make when they are still trying to protect normal life from turning into something else. I tried to verify it. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app and aimed it at the peephole, thinking maybe I could zoom in, maybe I could record something that would make sense later. And while I was fumbling with that, the thing outside moved away from the door slowly enough for me to see it through the glass, piece by piece, not walking the way a person walks, but unfolding backward. Too tall, shoulders narrow and bent forward, arms hanging too low, head angled down like the ceiling was almost too low for it. And when it reached the center of the hallway, I saw its face under the light by the stairwell door, and that was the moment my body stopped arguing with me. Because faces are where excuses usually come from, and there was nothing there to excuse. Just flat, pale skin split around a mouth that looked too long for the head, black, wet gums showing under closed teeth, eyes sunk so deep they looked like holes until the light caught them, and I saw they were open and fixed directly on my door. And I whispered, "No, no, no," without meaning to, because it had not glanced at my apartment. It had not been searching the hallway. It had been staring exactly at me through a door it should not have been able to see through. It stayed there while I backed away, and that was worse than if it had rushed me, because the way it stood told me it did not need to hurry, and my first real thought was that I needed another lock, something heavy against the door, anything. So I dragged my kitchen table over the floor and jammed it under the knob, even though I knew that would not stop something that size if it wanted in. And then I killed the lights in my apartment because I did not want it seeing me move from room to room, which made no sense because it had already locked onto me. But people do stupid small things when the bigger truth is too hard to hold in their head. And I crouched by the end of the couch, listening with my phone in my hand, and finally dialed 911. But when the call connected, there was nothing on the line except a low, static hiss and something under it that sounded like breathing through fluid. And I pulled the phone away and looked at the screen, and the call timer was moving. The connection was live, and I said, "Hello, can you hear me? There's something outside my door." And that sound on the other end stopped for half a second, and then answered me with, and I threw the phone onto the couch like it had burned me. The dragging started again, farther down the hall this time, moving away from my door, and I crawled back to the peephole and checked, and it was heading toward the stairwell at the end of the corridor, with the same slow, uneven motion, one shoulder dipping lower than the other, arms hanging almost to its knees. And for 1 second, I had this stupid flare of hope that it was leaving, that maybe it had picked the wrong floor or lost interest or whatever people tell themselves before they do the thing that ruins them. And then, just before it reached the stairwell door, it stopped and turned its head halfway back toward my apartment and held there like it was listening for me to follow. And I felt this pressure in my chest because I knew that if I stayed in that unit until morning, I would spend every minute waiting for the door to bow inward. So I made another bad decision and told myself I could get out the other way, down the back stairs to the parking level, into my car, out of the building, anywhere but there. I stuffed my wallet and keys into my pocket, left everything else, and moved the table as quietly as I could while my heart was beating so hard it hurt. When I opened the door, the hall smelled wrong right away, damp and old, like water sitting in a closed pipe. And the carpet outside my unit was dark in a line leading away from my door, as if something wet had been dragged over it. And I stepped into the hallway barefoot because I had not even thought about shoes, and the air felt colder than it should have on that floor, cold enough that my teeth touched when I breathed in, and I kept staring at the stairwell door at the far end, expecting it to swing open, but it stayed shut. So I started moving the other direction toward the elevator, keeping close to the wall, every apartment door on both sides closed and dead still. And I remember hating that more than anything. All those people a few feet away asleep behind their locks, while I was trying not to make enough sound to be noticed by something that had already noticed me. I pressed the elevator button once, and the light did not come on. I pressed it again, harder. Nothing. I said, "Come on," and the words shook in my throat. Then from behind the stairwell door at the far end, I heard the metal push bar flex slowly inward and release, not opening, just testing. I ran for the other stairwell near the trash room without thinking, and the sound of my bare feet on the hallway floor felt loud enough to wake the dead. And halfway there, the door behind me opened, and I heard it enter the hall, not fast, just there now, rolling through the corridor behind me. And I did not turn around because I already knew what I would see, but I could hear the drag in its movement picking up, closer each second, and I hit the stairwell door with my shoulder and almost fell down the first flight because the concrete stairs were painted smooth and cold, and the building lights in there were dim enough to leave the corners black. I caught the railing and kept going down, from the 4th floor to the 3rd, hearing it come through the stairwell door above me, then the metal rail shake under a weight that was too heavy for the sound it made, like it was moving lightly on purpose. I yelled, "Help! Somebody help me!" But the stairwell swallowed it. No doors opened, no voices answered, just my breath, my steps, and that thing coming down after me without rushing. On the 2nd floor landing, I risked a look up and saw it clearly through the bars of the railing above me. bent over the inner edge of the stairs and watching me descend. One long hand wrapped around the metal so tight the paint was flaking under its fingers. Its face pointed down at me, mouth slightly open now, and that wet black line between its teeth looked wider than it should have been. It was not stumbling or hunting around. It was following, the same way somebody walks after a child they know cannot get far. I felt my legs start to weaken from panic, and I slapped the wall button by the second floor door, hoping maybe I could trigger the hallway alarm somehow. But nothing happened, except the latch clicking, and I burst out onto that floor without even checking where I was going. The hallway there was darker than mine, because one of the ceiling lights had gone out, and for a second, I thought I could start pounding on doors, but then I heard the stairwell door behind me ease open, and I knew I did not have enough time to convince strangers to let in a half-dressed man who sounded insane. So I ran toward the elevator bank again, saw the red emergency exit sign above the service corridor, and cut down that way toward the maintenance room and the back stairs that led to the parking structure. That service corridor was narrower than the residential halls and had no carpet, just painted concrete that made every step slap back at me. And there were exposed pipes on the ceiling, and a smell of bleach and rust that stung my nose. And as I passed the maintenance room, I saw the door sitting half open with light inside it, bright fluorescent light. And because fear makes you bargain with stupid shelter, I ducked in and shoved the door closed behind me. The room was small and square, with shelves of paint cans, mop handles, folded caution signs, and a utility sink in the corner. And there was no second exit. And the second I realized that, my stomach dropped so hard I had to grab the sink to stay upright. I had trapped myself. I stood there, trying not to breathe too loudly while the overhead fixture buzzed above me. And outside in the corridor, I heard nothing at all for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20. Long enough for me to start hoping it had gone past. And then the door handle turned down slowly and held there. I backed away until my spine hit the shelving unit. The handle lifted again. Silence. Then from the other side of the door, inches from my face through cheap painted wood. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop any sound coming out of me, and stared at the center of the door while the thin metal around the latch bent inward a little. Not from impact, just pressure. Something leaning gently against it to show it could come through whenever it wanted. That was when I noticed the ceiling vent over the sink. One of those cheap square grates, big enough maybe for duct access. And I do not know why I even looked at it, until I heard a scrape above me. Not in the hall, in the room, overhead. Something moving slowly through the metal ductwork where nothing that size should have fit. I looked up and the vent cover trembled once. Then again. A fine drift of dust fell into the sink. I said, "Please." And I do not even know who I was talking to. Maybe the building, maybe my own body, maybe God. And then the door latch snapped. I did not wait to see it come in. I yanked the door open before it could push through and ran straight into the corridor, because the only thing worse than it being in front of me was the idea of it being above and below me at the same time in that little room. And as I sprinted down the service hall toward the parking stairs, I heard it come out behind me, with that dragging step and a sound like a laugh with no voice in it, just air forced through a ruined throat. The door to the parking stairwell crashed open under my hand, and I started down again, lower this time, past the ground floor toward the underground level where my car was parked, and the air got colder with each flight and smelled like exhaust and wet concrete, and there were fewer lights working down there, patches of shadow swallowing whole corners of the landings. My foot slipped once, and slammed into a step hard enough to split the skin on my toes, but I barely felt it then. I hit the bottom door and burst into the parking structure, and the relief lasted maybe 1 second before I saw how empty it was. Rows of concrete pillars, pools of pale light, oil stains. My car halfway down the nearest lane. No movement, no people, no engine sounds. Just that huge, dead space with enough places to disappear in that I suddenly understood why it had let me keep moving. Open places are not safer when there is nowhere to hide. I ran to my car and hit the fob and heard nothing. I hit it again. Nothing. I looked at it in my hand, and the little light that should have flashed was dead. I must have dropped it earlier, or the battery had finally gone, or maybe none of that mattered, and it simply was not going to work, because nothing had worked since the moment that thing stopped outside my door. I grabbed the handle anyway, and the door was locked. I smacked the window with my palm hard enough to sting and said, "Open, open," as if the car could hear me beg. Then I heard it in the garage, not close, not far, somewhere between the pillars behind me. And the sound moved strangely in that space, bouncing off concrete until I could not place it. And when I turned, I saw it step into one of the light pools about 30 feet away. I can still see it exactly. It was taller down there because there was more room for it to unfold. Spine crooked, chest narrow, ribs visible under that pale, cracked skin. Arms too long and ending in hands that looked almost normal until you saw how the fingers bent backward at the knuckles when they touched the ground. Its face was pointed at me, but not level, tilted down and to one side, like it was trying to study me from an angle that made more sense to it. There was dark wetness around its mouth and down the center of its chest, like it had been pressing that face against something for a long time. One of its legs dragged a fraction behind the other, but not from weakness, more like a habit. It made eye contact with me and held it, and I knew then that everything up to that point had been movement it allowed. The chase had never been about catching me. It had been about teaching me there was no place in that building it could not enter before I did. I backed away from the car, and it took 1 step forward. I stopped, and it stopped. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" And it answered by opening its mouth wider than the shape of its skull seemed able to support, and letting out that rolled through the garage and came back at me from every direction. I ran again, but there was nowhere left to run except deeper into the level, weaving around columns, slipping on painted lines, trying doors that all needed key access from that side, slamming my shoulder into one after another until my whole arm went numb. Behind me, I could hear it changing direction without hurry, not missing my turns, not losing track when I cut between cars. And once, when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it not behind me, but ahead, standing at the end of the lane I was running toward, like it had taken a path through the dark I had not seen, and I almost fell trying to stop. I veered left between 2 parked SUVs and came out into a dead section closed off by a chain barrier and a concrete wall. I hit the wall with both hands before I understood there was nothing beyond it. I turned around, and there it was, at the open end of that lane, crouched now, head low, one hand against the ground, looking smaller only because it had decided to come down closer to my height. The smell hit me first. Damp stone, bad water, something spoiled and trapped. I backed into the wall and said, "Please don't." And the thing took one slow step, then another. And what terrified me most in that final distance was how careful it was, how deliberate, how impossible it felt that something built like that could move with so little wasted effort. When it reached me, it did not slash or lunge. It lifted one hand and placed it against the wall beside my head, fingers spreading over the concrete with a soft scrape, pinning me there without even touching me, and leaned in until its face was inches from mine. Its eyes were not empty after all. Up close, I could see something moving in them. Not light, not reflection, just attention, focused and steady and old enough to make me feel smaller than I have ever felt in my life. Its mouth parted, and I heard the sound building in its throat, wet and low, and I shut my eyes because there was nowhere else left to go. But that only made it worse because I could feel its breath hit my face, colder than the garage air. And I understood something then that I had been too scared to admit before, which was that it had been outside my door because it already knew where I lived. Not that night, maybe not for the first time, and the reason the hallway had gone quiet was because it had been standing there, listening to me on the other side long before I ever checked the peephole. I opened my eyes again because not seeing it felt like surrender, and it was still there, watching me. And then it leaned closer until its mouth touched my ear and let out, If you're listening to this, then listen to the spaces around you when this ends. Because if you have a hallway outside your door, if you have a stairwell in your building, if you hear something dragging where nobody should be awake, you need to understand that I heard it first when it stopped outside my apartment. And right now, you are hearing me after it learned how to wait. If you have a horror story of your own, please feel free to drop it in the comments section. You never know. The next story could be yours. Subscribe to The Vault so you don't miss what comes next.